Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the video. Today I'm going to show you 15 different tips and tricks you can try to help improve your mix. You might already know some of them, so I've put the different sections down in the comments below, so feel free to skip around to the ones that you want to learn. Let's get started. Tip number 1, turn all your faders all the way down and then bring them up one at a time in order of what you want to hear, what's most important. That's a really quick way to go through your whole mix and kind of restart in case your volumes and stuff have gotten a little convoluted along the way. Just start over, redo your faders. You'll be surprised how much that helps to improve your mix and bring the important elements out front. Tip number 2, make sure you're not clipping. Make sure that your stereo out is not, so I got really close there, I got to minus 0.2, but either make sure to manage your levels, and if you really want to make sure you're not clipping, you can just grab a limiter. So under Logic, Dynamics, you've got a limiter right there, and just set the ceiling to minus 0.1. And then no matter what happens, you're not going to clip. However, it's better to make sure your levels are under control without the limiter, but you could still have the limiter there as a precaution. Tip number 3 is panning. So if you're not familiar with panning, it's how left or right a certain object sounds, where it's placed in the playback, basically. So if you pan it all the way to the left, it'll be all the way in your left ear, and vice versa on the right ear. So if you don't pan anything, it's going to be all right up the middle and you're going to lose some detail. So a good example of that is on my rhythm guitars here. I have them hard panned. There's 2 of them. So I have one all the way on the left and one all the way on the right. So when they're panned, they sound like this. But when they're right up the middle, so that doesn't sound as good, but by themselves is one thing. Once you add in, say, like drums, bass, and vocal, it starts to get hard to hear other things that need to be in the middle, like your kick drum, your snare drum, your vocals. Lead guitar too. It's all right up in the middle. So what you could do is pan these around to create a little more space. We also have 2 lead guitars here. That's such a good way to add space and just spread things out, make your mix sound bigger too. Here's all the guitars right up the middle. So if you're not utilizing panning, definitely start using it. You might have already known about that one, but it's definitely worth mentioning on a tutorial on how to improve your mix. The next tip is to reference your entire mix in mono. The reason this is important is because some playback systems are in mono, and a lot of times people aren't listening in stereo. Back in the old days when you used to share an earbud with someone, you're each essentially getting kind of a mono signal. Granted, it's what's only on the left or what's only on the right, but the elements that are in mono are both on the left and the right. So it's important that your mix can translate well in mono. If you can hear everything clearly in mono, then you'll definitely be able to hear everything clearly when you put it in stereo. So a good way to do this, I like to use Logic's gain plugin. If you're not using Logic, there might be something else you can use. But there's this mono button right here, so you can very easily switch it back and forth. Here's stereo. Here's mono. So you can hear in mono, you can still hear everything you could in stereo. It's just together. If you put it all in mono and you can't hear things, then you might need to start making some space with EQ or make some volume changes. This is a great way to kind of test your mix and see how it does. Tip 5, make your lows mono. Pick a point in the frequency spectrum, maybe around 80 hertz or 120, and make everything below that, put it in mono, or at least make it more narrow. So the reason this is important is because a lot of playback systems that have a sub don't usually have stereo subs. They will most likely have a mono sub and stereo mains. And so what this means is that you have all this stereo information down low that's going to the subs, but it's only recreating it in mono. Also, if your low end is in mono, very narrow, it's going to make your top end sound wider by comparison. So if everything's really wide or everything's really mono, you don't have a very wide stereo image. But when you have some things that are very mono and some things that are very wide, that's how you get the best stereo image. So a good way to do this is either on the individual track level, going around to each of my things that occupy low end, like my kick, my toms, my bass, and folding them down, making sure they're in mono. So here's my bass. And let's say, for instance, that it's a big 80s chorus bass that's in stereo, right? It sounds great by itself, but all that information on the sides isn't going to translate that well below a certain frequency. So what you can do is add a crossover. And I like to do this with the direction mixer. Whatever you're using, there's something like this. You'll probably just need to find it. Feel free to let me know in the comments what you're using, and I can try to figure out what you can use to do this. But there's a split right here, a crossover, and you can set where you want to cross over. So let's use 100 hertz, for instance. And now we've split it. We have a spread for our highs and a spread for our lows. So basically a separate knob for everything below 100 and a separate knob for everything above 100. So what we can do is make this spread low mono. Took it down to 0. It's kind of hard to hear, but I can confidently know that everything below 100 hertz is right up the middle. It's going to stay cleaner. It's going to hit harder. It's important to do this. It might not always make a big difference, but it'll definitely add up if you have a lot of things down there that are occupying a lot of space. You want to keep them right in the middle, and then it'll make everything else up top sound a little bit wider. You could also do this on your whole mix. If, say, you're in a mastering situation, and you don't have access to the individual files, put a direction mixer on your final master and fold the bottom down. If you're doing it on the mastering level, you might not want to fold it down all the way. Maybe do like a 50%, because if you have something like toms that should be panned around, then that low end's going to get a little flattened. Just something to think about, but this is definitely a great tip to improve your mix. Tip number 6, low cut. If you're not familiar with low cut, this is the lowest part of the EQ where you can roll off build up and low frequencies that you don't necessarily want there. So a great example of this that I'm going to show you is on these guitars. So when I mixed the song, I added this set of processing. So I rolled off lows in multiple spots. What I'm going to do to simulate that is just use a channel EQ so it's a little clearer, easier to understand. So this is the guitars, how they came, raw, nothing going on. Still fairly clean, but you can see occasionally we're getting some buildup down there. I'm just going to roll this off and make sure I do it on both. So when I play that with the bass, you can really start to hear how those frequencies interact. Here's without the low cut. It might be hard to hear. It's kind of a subtle difference, but this is just on 2 tracks. So if you suddenly get a huge mix with like 40 or 50 tracks that are all starting to get down there, you're going to start to not hear your bass and you're not going to know why. So you're going to start boosting the low end frequencies, but it's not a low end frequency lacking problem. It's actually that there's too much happening down in the low end. So you want to clean that up, save room for the things that matter down there, like your kick, your bass, your snare. Things to note. Most of these tracks came in really clean, so I don't have that issue too much, but especially if it's not as high quality of a recording, or maybe it was recorded live and there's like wind in the mics, there's so many variables, using the low cut can really help clean that up. Tip 7, carve out some space with EQ. So what this means is instead of using your EQ as a tonal shaper, actually carving out space for different instruments. I'll use rhythm guitar and lead guitar as an example here. So I've got my 2 sound sources here, rhythm and lead guitar. They sound a little different because they're playing different notes, but they're also definitely occupying the same frequency. So what I'm going to do is carve a little space out of my rhythm guitar for my lead guitar to exist in. And what you're going to want to do to achieve this is play both of them together, probably soloed, and then boost one of them, sweep around until you find where it's interfering with the second item or second track. So I'm going to boost my rhythm guitar until I hear it interfering the most with the lead guitar, and then cut there, because that's where the lead guitar is trying to occupy. That's a good cut right there. And then what you can do on the flip side is I'll copy this EQ over to the lead guitar and then actually boost the lead guitar where I cut the rhythm guitar. So it's a subtle difference, but also that will add up across your mix if you have lots of things competing. Just try to notch out little spaces for everything that's important to hear. Tip number 8 is group compression. And what I mean by group compression is essentially a bus for a few different instruments. Say in the example of the guitars, we'll keep using the guitars. All of my guitars go to this guitar bus and they're being compressed by this Slate Digital compressor here. And the benefit of compressing individual groups is, one, it kind of helps to glue those groups together, helps to give them a more cohesive sound. And then the second thing is that it'll help balance levels between the different instruments in that group. So if you're rolling along and then all of a sudden your lead guitar gets a little bit louder, that compressor is going to compress the whole group a little bit. So not only is your lead guitar being controlled, but the volumes of all your guitars together are being controlled. So it'll help to balance that energy a little bit as well. You can also use this as a way to improve punch and aggression of certain sources. I did this on the rhythm guitars where I ran them to their own little subgroup that's getting compressed really hard by this VG distressor plugin. And the idea is that whenever the guitars start playing, they pop into the compressor really hard, and the compressor has a slow attack so that that transient cuts through. And then after that, they get compressed back to their usual level. So it helps my rhythm guitars to sound super punchy when they come in, because whenever they re-enter, there's a loud transient spike. Cool things you can do. It'll help add clarity and definition to your mix and improve the overall control of the volumes in your mix. Tip number 9 is very similar, but it's on the MasterBus. So it's MasterBus Compression. So the idea with MasterBus Compression is very similar to group compression, except it's on your entire track. And so you need to be a little more gentle here because it's going to affect everything. But what I like to do is use this Waves SSL compressor with the slowest attack and the fastest release. And we're just aiming for a little bit of compression. So I'm just compressing like a dB or two, but I'll bypass that and re-engage it so you can hear what's happening. Bypassed. Engaged. Subtle difference, but you got to do it. Everybody does that. It really helps to make your track sound more cohesive and glued together. And it also helps control the levels, any level spikes you might have in your track. You can use any compressor you want to do this. I just really like the Waves SSL compressor. The next one is also on the MasterBus, and it's EQ for the MasterBus. And when you EQ the MasterBus, I'd recommend leaning towards something a little more colored, I guess, depending on what you're going for. In this instance, I'm looking to add color and character to the mix, so I want to use a kind of a vintage style tube EQ. So I'm going to use, Logic has one I'm going to use. Logic, EQ, vintage tube EQ. And the idea here is just to add a little bit more lows and a little bit more kind of sparkle sheen on the top end. We're super gentle. We don't want to go crazy with it. Okay, so I boosted 2 dB of lows around 60 hertz and 3 dB of highs around 8K. And then I brought my overall volume back down about 2 dB because I don't want to add too much to the mix. I don't want to like gain energy. I just want to change how the frequencies are. So here's without it. Here's with it. Just adds a little more oomph and a little more kind of fancy, expensive sound on the top. Try it, see if that works for your mix. Moving on. This next one's a little more complicated, but it's called sidechaining your effects to your vocals. So what that means is we're going to put a compressor on our vocal effects, and instead of that compressor triggering on the content in that channel, we're going to have this compressor trigger off of what's happening on our vocal, specifically our lead vocal. So right here, but these things can't stay the way they are. We've got a vocal, we've got delay. I'm going to put a compressor on the delay. It's a regular one will do. Most compressors will have this option for a sidechain. You just have to find it. Mine's right up here, and then you can go in and pick a whole bunch of things. You can compress off of audio channels, input channels, bus channels. So I'm going to go to this one, this lead Aaron. That's what I want to, that's the main vocal. Now, instead of it compressing based on what's happening coming down the channel, it's going to compress based on what that other sidechain channel is doing. But these things can't stay the way they are. And the idea here is that when the vocal is happening, the delays are going to be turned down. And then when the vocal goes away, it'll turn the delays up back to their regular level. And this is a great way to create space for your vocals, but still have them feel wide and ambient and affected. But these things can't stay the way they are. But these things can't stay the way they are. So now we're compressing about 7 decibels whenever the vocal happens. And I set the release so that it felt like a natural kind of release re-entry to the delay there. And now I can actually turn the delay up a lot louder because it's staying out of the way better. But these things can't stay the way they are. Nice. But these things can't stay the way they are. Completely out of the way, but you still have the ambience. We could do the same thing on this reverb here. Nice. That sounds good. I'm gonna add a little bit of makeup gain. But these things can't stay the way they are. Nice. So now when the vocal gets done, there's this little pop of effects. It's a really popular thing for like pop music and those really intimate vocal sounds, but it works just as well in this aggressive style. But these things can't stay the way they are. Nice. It's really subtle, but it's definitely one of those details that helps take your mix from like great to really professional sounding. The next thing is sidechaining your instruments to your vocals. So guitars have this tendency to get in the way of vocals, especially if they're distorted and more aggressive sounding. So what I like to do is actually compress the guitars out of the way when the vocals happen. So really similar concept here, but I'm going to use C6 instead, made by Waves. I'm using my whole vocal bus as the trigger. And the nice thing about C6 is that you don't have to compress the whole frequency spectrum. You can just compress a small area. So I've soloed up the guitars and I've soloed up this band on the guitars. And what I'm going to do is sweep around and find where it gets in the way of the vocals the most. But these things can't stay the way they are. Probably right there. These things can't stay the way they are. So then we're going to flip that band over to external. So that means it's going to trigger when the vocal's happening. But these things can't stay the way they are. And then it lets that frequency back in when the vocals are done. So now I'll open up the frequencies and let you hear that even though the high range of the guitars, those high mids are being tamed when the vocals happen, the full sound of the guitars are still there, just minus that little area. So it's basically automating some space in there. So it's hands off after that. It just creates the space for you. And that's probably a little more dramatic than I would actually do it, but for the sake of explaining and you being able to hear it easier, I did it a little more dramatic. The next one is simply putting a room reverb on your instruments, all your instruments that take up space, minus the bass. Don't do anything like that to the bass. I mean, do it if you want, but you didn't hear it from me. Generally, I'd recommend picking a reverb that sounds like a good room space and then sending all your instruments there. The only thing I do a little differently is I send a different one for the drums, just depending on how I'm feeling. So my drums have a reverb. Here's the drums. This is actually the raw drum sound right here. There's room mics in this, but no room reverb, and it sounds fairly small. Granted, the room sounds good, but I want it a lot bigger because that little bit of ambience is going to immediately get eaten up by everything else. Right? So I added a reverb. I use Space Designer for this. Realistic room. That's a good one. It's realistic. So here's drums with the reverb, without the reverb. You don't want it too loud, but you definitely want it to be noticed. And when you're soloing it up, it can feel a little louder because once you add in everything else, it eats up that ambience. So I did the same thing with my guitars. So I didn't put it on my rhythm guitars just because I want them to be really tight with all the rhythmic changes happening and pauses and stuff. But I did put it on my lead guitars. And if I had a mix with a lot more keyboards and acoustic guitars, I'd definitely send them to the room reverb as well. But here's the lead guitars without the reverb. And here's with it. Adding reverb to some of your less important things, like the lead guitar in this instance, will also help to create like the kind of space where something's in your face and something's a little bit further away. And so the idea is like your kick and your snare and your vocals and your bass, they're a little up closer. And then you add some reverb to other elements like your lead guitars, backing vocals, and that'll make the sound like it's further away. And so not only are you working on your left-right space with the panning and the mono low end, but then you add in the reverb to make things sound further away. Lowering the volume will also make things sound further away. So you mix those two things, the reverb and the volume, to get the front to back depth. Okay, next one is just fun. It's adding tape saturation. You can add it to individual channels. I did a video last week about FabFilter Saturn and how it can add saturation to drums. So here it is. I've put it on every channel in my drums. So here's my drums without saturation. And here's with saturation. That's a big difference. You can also add saturation to basically anything you need to cut through better. So say we want our bass to cut through more, you can add saturation there. I'll go into Fat Effects. Add some soft saturation, some vari drive. And what this does is adds harmonic content up higher on the frequency spectrum. And what that means is that if it's being played back on a system that doesn't have as much low end, like somebody's iPhone or something, then that harmonic content is going to come through better because it's not just limited to that low end. So something to think about. You can also add saturation to, add it to whatever you want, but you can add it to your whole mix very gently, add it to your whole mix. So I'll show you what that sounds like. If you want to add some grit and detail, again, super gentle, but you can add it to your MasterBus. The last thing is the last one is a must for anyone, but I call it the mix translation trick, and I've seen other people talk about it. I don't remember who I got it from, but basically what you do is you put an EQ on your stereo out. I usually put the low end somewhere around 200 hertz and then the top end around 5K. And what this is going to do is simulate like the worst case scenario for playback of your song. So I'll show you what it sounds like. It's like right there. And the idea here is you put that on your stereo out and reference your mix and make sure that you can hear everything. Because if you can hear your drums, bass, your low end, and your ultra highs like cymbals and the top end of vocals like the detail, if you can hear everything, then no matter where you play this back, it's going to sound good. Like we can hear our bass in there very clearly, even though the fundamental of the bass is much lower than where we're rolling off. If you put this on there and you cannot hear certain things, then you need to go back and address kind of why that's not coming through. Maybe it needs some more saturation. Maybe it needs to be louder. Maybe you're boosting too much in the super low and you need to boost some low mids, or clean up certain frequencies so there's room in the middle of your mix for everything to translate through. Definitely do that. At least reference. Don't mix your whole track that way, but definitely reference it so you can get a feel of how it's going to play back on other devices. That wraps up the video for 15 different tips and tricks you can try that'll help improve your mix. Let me know if this was helpful, and let me know in the comments what your favorite tip was, or maybe something you learned from this video. Thanks so much for watching, and please make sure you like and subscribe.